were approved on the basis of only a single study. Moreover, only 27% of these studies were randomized and only 14% were blinded. Only half had a comparison control group. Thus, the majority of high-risk implanted devices were approved without the support of high-quality data on safety and effectiveness. For example, as chronicled in the Chicago Tribune last week, the Mixo valve, an annuloplasty ring permanently implanted as a heart valve replacement, was approved through a 510(k) process. This valve clearly falls within the definition for a Class 3 device and was originally classified as such by the FDA. However, according to the Tribune, the FDA, quote, rubber-stamped, unquote, the device industry's request to downgrade from Class 3 to Class 2 in 2001. The petition for reclassification cited studies finding that the rings were safe and effective. However, none of the studies were randomized clinical trials, and there were other problems. Many of the study investigators were heart surgeons who invented the devices and had financial relationships were receiving royalties from the manufacturer. These relationships were not revealed to the patients who received these annuloplasty rings. Moreover, Edwards had sold these devices for 2.5 years without FDA 510(k) clearance, as the company had determined from an FDA document that a new 510(k) was not needed. However, shortly after press reports on this missing FDA clearance, the company submitted a new 510(k) and FDA ultimately cleared the device in April 2009. There were no penalties to the company for this infraction. In the most recent 5-year period, there have been more than 3,400 adverse events reported involving annuloplasty rings, and these rings have been linked to only 56 fewer deaths than heart replacement valves. Yet the annuloplasty ring went through a 510(k) clearance without benefit of clinical trials. This number is especially disturbing as it's estimated that only 5% of all adverse events are ever reported. Adverse event reporting is voluntary for hospitals and doctors. Manufacturers are required to report deaths and injuries. However, there are an unknown number of delays in adverse event reporting by the manufacturer. For example, last April, an FDA inspection of medical device maker Edwards Lifesciences identified 6 complaints of adverse events related to use of mitral annuloplasty rings and pericardial prosthetic heart valves that were not reported to the FDA within the required 30-day window. The FDA is sorely underfunded for its enormous mission of protecting the public health by assuring food, drug, and device safety. FDA device review is partially supported by industry user fees, but currently device user fees are lower than pharmaceutical user fees, even though drug trials are much more expensive to conduct than device trials. The PMA user fees provide less than 1/4 of the estimated $870,000 average cost of the review in terms of FDA staff and resources, thus creating a disincentive for FDA to use the PMA process even when Congress had intended its use for high-risk devices. Increasing the budget for the Center for Devices would help speed up device approvals by allowing more FDA staffers to review applications more expeditiously. But the process cannot and should not be speeded up by foregoing the requirements for data of safety and effectiveness. Finally, the device approval process has been compared to the European process, but a recent review in the BMJ found that while European conditions may be more favorable for industry, they are not necessarily best for patients. The decision-making process in Europe occurs behind closed doors. There is no publicly available reason for granting a CE mark, the European approval. The BMJ editors attempted to contact 192 manufacturers to get evidence of the clinical data used to approve their devices in Europe, and every one was denied access, stating that, quote, clinical data is proprietary information. True innovations are welcomed, but cannot be recognized as such without clinical trial evidence to show that new technologies are beneficial for patients. Only high-quality clinical trials can assure safety and benefit, especially for invasive devices from which patients incur risk of infection, bleeding, and even death. It is well worth the time up front to gather data of safety and effectiveness so that my fellow cardiologists and I can confidently tell our patients that implantation of a device is in their best interest. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Laser's son, I assume that you and your colleagues help people with all of these great ideas, find the resources to develop some of the products that they manufacture and put together. Is that?
We certainly try to, yes, sir.
And every conversation almost that you have about health care, there's the whole issue of cost, the issue of liability, the issue of risk. If standards are altered, let's say perhaps downward, would that pose a problem for the people in your business?
Well, we don't think the standards should be lowered, as a matter of fact. We support the safety and efficacy standard. The question, and I think this is the point Dr. Shern was making, is it's the question of how it is implemented and how the agency manages it. So we're not at all suggesting a reduction in the standard. We're recommending, in fact, what the agency does already in some cases when it works very well, which is to change the balances within the standard, the levels of evidence, for example, what is believed to be significant, what's meaningful, depending on the context and all of the and other factors that may be relevant. The agency does this already in many, many cases. It is really the common sense thing to do. I'm sure Dr. Shern would agree. It's just a question of how do we make this a consistent practice within the FDA.
So then the higher the standards, the more comfort you and your colleagues have relative to the likelihood of trial lawyers getting involved in your business and lawsuits and all of those kind of things.
You know, we think there really is value in the FDA setting a rational bar for approval. All of the points Dr. Shern made we agree with in that respect. It's really a question of the internal balance in the last few years, we believe, has really gotten out of whack, and that the risk side of this equation has come to really dominate the culture of the FDA. And we don't suggest the basic risk-benefit idea should be abandoned in any sense, or safety and efficacy. It's really just bringing it back into balance.
Dr. Goldahert, part of the discussion this afternoon has centered around some comparison between what we do with our Food and Drug Administration, what's done in the European Union. Given the discussion, if you had to say, let's maintain and perhaps even maybe intensify, would that be your position, or would it be, well, we probably could get away with becoming more like them?
I think that the idea of the FDA being the gold standard is what we should aspire to. I think that regulation can be a competitive tool, as it has been in the past in the U.S., and that our goal should be to make the regulatory process the best in the world, which also means the most efficient and the highest performing. I think the industry's goal is exactly that. In other words, to have clear communications on standards between industry and the agency, and to see a process in which those standards are clearly applied and implemented. The comments earlier about changing goalposts, about not knowing what's required, is something that bothers many companies. And I think there are enormous opportunities for performance improvements, many of which Dr. Shern in his comments focused upon.
Dr. Redberg, you express a great deal of affinity for innovation and for being able to come up with new approaches, new techniques, new technology. But pretty much it seems to me that you were saying at the end of the day that we really need to have as much assurance as we can possibly have that whatever it is that we've come up with is going to work in the best interest of the patient, and that they're going to be able and should be able to feel safe, secure, and comfortable with what we've got. Is that an interpretation of what you were saying?
That's correct, Mr. Davis. Absolutely. As I said, innovation is, a great advance in medical care, but a new technology, just because something is new, doesn't mean it's good for patients. And so and we have gotten to an era where we have a lot more devices and a lot more complex technology, but that means there's a lot of downside. We're mostly talking about implanted devices that are going inside someone's body. And so it's really incumbent upon us to know that before I recommend that device to be implanted in my patient, that I have clinical data, high-quality clinical data, showing safety and effectiveness. And really, it's effectiveness because we don't need to talk about safety if there's no benefit to implanting that device. And as Dr. Shuren pointed out, the EU standard does not include effectiveness. But, we all know, we've heard about the metal-on-metal recalls, the ICD lead recalls. There was just the Boston Scientific recall a few days ago. These devices have been implanted and lead to serious adverse events, including death. And so I do embrace innovation, but it has to be shown to be beneficial.
Well, let me thank all three of you for sharing your expertise with us and for your willingness to come and testify. And I thank you very much and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Laserson, if you're going to change the risk structure, are you also advocating changing the litigation structure that we have in this country?
Wow, that's a hard one. I think that litigation absolutely does contribute to excess use of a lot of medical technology. And I think that is a factor that we really have to consider. So I think reasonable litigation reform is something to think about. In terms of the risk side of it, I don't think that the view is at all to accept greater risk in the sense that a device that the risk benefit has become undesirable. The argument is that you accept a higher level of risk only if there is a higher level of benefit to balance it out. So obviously,
how do you know that balancing?
That's the job of the FDA and then ultimately the medical community. It's the decision that a physician makes every day. Every decision a physician makes involves some level of risk versus
But
benefit.
the physician doesn't do it for devices. Physicians aren't well-equipped to go do their own research, I would not imagine. So how do you suggest that physicians who wind up using these products and devices, how do they balance risk with efficacy?
So they don't do it across the board. First of all, the FDA really does make that decision ultimately, right? And we believe in that system. So the FDA is ultimately responsible for deciding that a particular device, the risk-benefit is favorable, and that's why it's approved. But what a physician does is when that approval happens, it's approved for a very broad population of patients. It may not actually be an appropriate use of a device in a particular patient. And that's really what the physician does. A physician might decide that the use of a drug-eluting stent, even though it's technically approved for particular use, in a particular patient with a particular set of comorbidities and risk factors, perhaps age, perhaps diabetes, other unfavorable factors, that in that particular case, the risk-benefit is not worthwhile to use it. So even though the FDA is primarily responsible for this, putting a device onto the market, ultimately a physician really exercises fine-tuned judgment about whether to use a particular device in a particular patient.
I'm with you, and I got to confess, I'm just a prosecutor from South Carolina that made very poor grades in math and science. So say it slow for me to get it. The FDA doesn't do the research, though, correct?
No, but it relies on the research that's
All right.
provided to
To
it.
Dr. Redberg's point, what in your paradigm eliminates physicians who have a fiscal stake in the outcome of the research? Where would you factor that into it?
First of all, it has to be disclosed. The industry has taken a very, very strong position on this, that any conflicts of interest must be disclosed. If they are not disclosed, that's, I think, a mistake. I think they should be disclosed so that people like the FDA can weigh that in their analysis of the validity of the data that's being provided to them. In certain cases, it may be completely inappropriate for a physician to conduct, for example, a clinical trial if they are the inventor of the technology and there are other alternatives. It may very well not be appropriate in that case.
Dr. Gallagher, let me see if I can qualify you as an expert in contrasting our system with the European system. Are you aware of any studies that suggest the recall rate is higher in Europe than the United States?
No.
Are you aware of any studies that indicate the bad outcome rate is higher in the European Union than in the United States?
No.
Is the litigation rate higher in the European Union than the United States?
No.
Is there anything about the United States system that you think is superior to the European system?
Yes.
What is it?
I think that, on balance, the centralized approach with a stronger publicly funded science base is a better system than a completely distributed system. However, I think that there is some balance to be struck and that there are lessons that we can learn from the European system in addition to that.
If Dr. Shuren were to go on a vacation for 2 weeks and appoint you the head of FDA for this section, what are the first 3 things you would do before he got back?
We'd all be in trouble. But I think one of the things that would be interesting to know is to gain a deeper understanding of what's happening in Europe. Quite clearly, there's been a major migration of medical technology companies, of technologies invented in America that are being introduced first in Europe. There's an economics of that, and we understand part of it. What we don't understand nearly well enough is the taxonomy of the European system. We need more information. That would be a high priority, because right now, Europe is outcompeting us with respect to their regulatory process, and it's exerting an economic cost in terms of jobs and innovation in the U.S. The second thing is to decide which things can be done immediately from a managerial perspective in the agency to improve its performance. And the third thing is a corollary to that, which is what needs legislation. Right now, we're in the MDUFA negotiation process. There are some things that Congress needs to legislate in order to promote agency improvement, and we need a better understanding of what's managerial and what the leaders can do and what needs congressional support. And of course, part of that, which Dr. Shuren mentioned, is providing adequate resources for the agency. I think all of us believe that that's a fundamental principle.
Dr. Redberg, your passion and advocacy for your patients is palpable, and I would commend you for that. But I think you would agree that patients who either die or get sicker because they're waiting on the approval process to work, that's not any more fair to them if the delay is unnecessary than patients who are subjected to devices that are either unsafe or just don't work. So how do you strike the balance between risk, which is, I would imagine it's impossible to zero it out, but what level of risk is acceptable given the fact that for lots of patients, time is the greatest risk that they face?
Sure, I agree that we do have to strike a balance, and so certainly I want some clinical data, human data of benefit, particularly for a high-risk implanted device. But I think it is possible, to have a shorter follow-up period for studies, because obviously the longer the follow-up, the longer the time to approval. And I think a shorter period is fine, assuming that we have actual post-marketing data, because frequently the FDA mandates post-marketing data means we're going to follow that device for the next year or 2, 3 years, but that data actually is not ever coming. And so then, so if we had a more robust post-marketing system, I think that there's less onus on getting everything upfront pre-approval to FDA. And so I think we can strengthen the evidence both pre-market and post-market, kind of like the accelerated approvals for drugs that we do, to have that system with a real post-marketing registries where we follow. We have so many new carotid stents and defibrillators, but we have very little data on how patients are doing 1, 2, 3, 4 years later.
In your testimony, you stated, and others I think have stated today, that the European model doesn't include efficacy as part of the analysis, which, for, again, those of us that don't practice medicine and are not experts, that was surprising, because I wouldn't know what else you would consider. I guess safety, I guess it can be safe and still a placebo. Is that what you meant by that?
That's right. And actually, unfortunately, especially with devices, there is a lot of placebo effect. For example, recently vertebroplasties, the spinal procedure for back pain, has been FDA approved on the basis of a trial that did not have a sham control. A year or 2 after FDA approval, the New England Journal of Medicine published 2 randomized trials where they did vertebroplasty and then they did a sham control. There was no difference in the outcomes of those patients, certainly. And some insurance companies then reevaluated their approval. Medicare spends over $1 billion on vertebroplasty for this procedure that has never been shown to be more beneficial than a sham control. And so it's an excellent point. In order to see benefit, especially for a device, you have to have an adequate control group. But once you've established benefit, then the level of risk is going to depend on the patient, the population, and I think that can be better determined after FDA approval when you have widespread use. The other point about legal is for PMA approval. As you know better than I do, the Supreme Court by Regal versus Medtronic, that is the only patient protection for patients that have PMA devices. They cannot sue in state court for Regal versus Medtronic for devices.
I think we all agree we don't want our capital, our jobs, our companies fleeing the United States because our system is second-rate, nor do we want to trade safety for expediency. So thank you for helping educate the committee, the subcommittee, and we look forward to hearing from you again. I appreciate, again, your patience as we had to vote and go through 2 other panels, and I applaud your knowledge, your acumen, your professionalism, and your civility towards one another and to the subcommittee. Anything else, Mr. Davis?
No, sir.
With that, the subcommittee hearing is adjourned, and I will come down there and thank you. The hearing is adjourned.